What I want to do in this lecture is consider the pronunciation model that we teach you, received pronunciation, and discuss a bit how we define it, what it is, how it changes. And the first thing, point 1 on the handout, Roman 1, is to draw your attention to the fact that there's some uncertainty as to what criteria we ought to use to define what is and what isn't received pronunciation. I want to suggest that there are 3 quite different sets of criteria, at least, which we could apply in order to define, to circumscribe this accent received pronunciation. The first set of criteria, the first column, are what we might call sociolinguistic criteria. Now here we examine native-speaking English society and we ask what are the kinds of people who speak with received pronunciation. First of all, geographically, we're going to clearly state that this is a British accent, not, for example, an American accent, not an Irish accent. On the other hand, a tighter geographical definition may be contentious. We can't say it's the speech of London. We can't say it's the speech of Oxford, in spite of the persistence abroad of expressions like Oxford English, which are virtually obsolete in Britain. What we can, on the whole, say is that it's an accent of England, and only in a more limited extent to say that it's an accent of Scotland or of Wales, particularly an accent of England then. But within England, it has no specific geographical localization. You can't point to any one town or city in England and say the people who live there speak with received pronunciation and others don't. Rather, the remaining criteria must be social, to do with social class, socio-economic class. This is a difficult area to define, of course. The sociologists use a number of criteria to determine a person's social class, which include the level of education, the level of income, the occupation that you follow, father's occupation, the kind of housing that you live in. All of these things can be sort of given points and give you a score, which gives you a socio-economic class. Now, this is an approximation to the reality of society, because, of course, in practice, your social class is due to all sorts of factors of lifestyle and behavior patterns which are not necessarily measurable in those kinds of ways. But given that we devise some kind of a criterion for plotting social class, we can say that people have a relatively high or relatively low social class, and it's clear that received pronunciation is associated with the upper end of the social scale. Now the problem, of course, is to say just how far down it goes, and there's no objective way of deciding that, to decide that, and indeed whether it goes right up to the top or not. There are people who make a distinction between ordinary, if you like, mainstream RP and the supposedly affected or marked speech associated, for example, with Prince Charles or other members of the royal family, which they might see as offensively upper class. It's all a matter of perceptions, not of scientific objectiveness, of course. Well, my approach is to say that RP is associated with the top end of the social scale, but to be very reluctant to go further in using precise social criteria. Part of this is because I don't mix with members of the aristocracy, so I don't know many dukes or titled landowners whose speech I could analyse. Secondly, because it's clear that these sociolinguistic criteria are not really the only ones, or perhaps even the main ones, that we adopt. Because we have a second set of criteria, the second column on the handout, which concerns the ideal of good pronunciation. In English society, quite apart from considering the needs of foreign learners, among native English speakers, there are views about what is good and what is bad. There is a general consensus that the kind of speech that we can call received pronunciation is in some sense correct, beautiful, unmarked, classless, people often say. That's of course rubbish, but that's a term that you often find applied in the popular media to what is in practice received pronunciation. This is what Mrs. Thatcher endeavoured to adopt when she became a national politician. This is what John Major endeavoured to adopt when he became or aspired to become a national politician. Now we know that these people grew up in circumstances which would lead them to have a quite different kind of pronunciation. Margaret Thatcher was a grocer's daughter in a provincial small town in Grantham. Other things being equal, she would almost certainly have spoken with a kind of Midlands local accent. But things weren't equal. She went on to higher education. She was trained as an industrial chemist, she was trained as a barrister, she became a politician. And clearly that kind of speech she felt was not appropriate. So she became what I call a speaker of adopted RP. That's RP as something that one more or less consciously adopts, changing one's speech towards it, as a native speaker. She's not a native speaking RP speaker then, but an adoptive speaker. Similarly, John Major grew up in South London, in Brixton, then in Worcester Park, and his father was a trapeze artist in a circus, and then when he left that, he set up a small business producing and selling garden ornaments, garden gnomes. Well, again, that kind of background would lead you to expect someone to have quite a noticeable London accent. But John Major has succeeded in adopting what is now described as classless. Now, of course, the upper-class members of the cabinet look down on this kind of pronunciation. We have the recent memoirs of Alan Clark, one of Mrs. Thatcher's cabinet ministers, who comes from a pucker upper-class background. This is an expression we often use, of Indian origin, to refer to a genuine, authentic upper-class background. His father was Lord Clark, commonly known as Lord Clark of Civilization, his art critic and so on. Now, perhaps Alan Clark demonstrates his own insecurity by being extremely contemptuous to everybody whose class origins are not quite as superior as his own. But he certainly makes cutting remarks about the speech as well as other things in Mrs. Thatcher and also in John Major. But these are subtleties that lie far below the level at which they're of any interest to EFL. From looking at this from an EFL perspective, we don't need to make the kinds of very subtle distinctions that enable you to pick out people as being adoptive rather than native speakers of RP. Just let me give you a little bit of personal history before we go on. I have, through a sort of succession of chances really, ended up, in many respects, setting the defining criteria for RP, because people turn to me and they say, is this or isn't this RP? I have to give an answer. Well, I myself come from a rather class-uprooted background, as do many people of whom I'm representative. My father was an Anglican clergyman. Now this is something that can be quite an upper-class thing to be, but my father had no inherited money. Anglican clergy are paid very, very low rates. My mother, in fact, earned more than my father throughout the time that they were both alive and when I was growing up, because she was a school teacher. So I come from quite a poor background in terms of money. On the other hand, my father himself was an RP speaker. They were both of my parents were educated people, graduates. Because of winning scholarships, I was able to go to one of the great British public schools. My parents didn't have to pay for it. It was paid for by a charitable scholarship. That gave me the company of sons of upper-class people and wealthy people, which is not quite the same thing, and is no doubt partly responsible for the way I speak now. On the other hand, I then proceeded to have an academic career where it's appropriate to speak RP or something close to it. Not everybody does by any means, but there is a general push in that direction, obviously. And I compare myself with my brother, who shared an identical family background with me, and indeed an identical school background, but then he went on to become a businessman in Birmingham. And he felt it appropriate in his circumstances to adopt various local features of a Birmingham accent, not exactly a Birmingham working class accent, but various things that set him slightly apart from the way that I speak. He felt it was appropriate for him to adopt the Midlands pronunciation staff, where I have retained our family pronunciation staff in this class of words. So there are all sorts of personal factors that come into this. Now we come to the third business, EFL, the model for teaching English as a foreign language. Received pronunciation is what Daniel Jones adopted for this purpose. This is not obviously a correct choice to make. And particularly in more recent years, there are those who have said RP is not an appropriate model. After all, only some tiny fraction of the population of Britain, or of the total of native English speakers, speak with this accent, which is true. And if we apply strict sociolinguistic criteria with Trudgill, we may come to some figure like 3% of the British population. Indeed, when you have these actual random sample surveys, and you take 100 speakers, it's very frequently the case that there is not one of those speakers chosen at random who really seems to fit exactly RP as described in the books. So, what can we do about this? The question one has to ask, though, is if not RP, then what? Attempts to teach Scottish English, which enjoyed a vogue about 20, 30 years ago, have not been successful. Dutch learners asked to learn Scottish English felt they were being given something that wasn't proper English. Equally, if we attempted to teach Cockney, well, you'd laugh, you see. People wouldn't accept it. My reaction to this is to say what we have to do, we can retain the name received pronunciation, but we must widen it and we must update it. So the kind of notation that we teach you is actually applicable without much inaccuracy to the speech of perhaps half of the population of England. And by applying a few further extensions, like for example interpreting the vowel in love to cover the possibility of ov as well as a, so that it can mean love for northerners as well as love for southerners, it covers almost everybody in England. In particular, adopting the symbol in at the end of happy and so on allows us to bring in the millions and millions who say happy rather than happy. And that's one of the perhaps strongest defining criteria in London between proper RP and fairly superior London speech. We remain, though, with the difficulty that there are very widespread features universally condemned, of which H-dropping is a very good example. We had this in the lecture on Cockney. Now, local working class speech nearly everywhere in England involves H-dropping. Perhaps not consistent all the time, but quite frequent H-dropping. Yet everybody is agreed that H-dropping is not right. Anybody who drops H's will have their speech criticised on those grounds. Certainly any foreign learner who drops H's will also be regarded as pronouncing wrongly, and so it remains something for French and Italian and other people who have problems with H. They really must try and get that right, because it's not acceptable to drop the H's. I've actually picked out on the handout 3 phenomena for which we get different answers depending on whether we approach this from a sociolinguistic and ideal or an EFL point of view. Smoothing, this is the business of saying fire rather than fire, you remember, or saying going rather than going. Now, smoothing is a fact of life among the native-speaking RP speakers. If you listen to those who speak RP, something quite close to it, coming from the top end of the social scale, you will hear them doing this. doing. Not doing, but doing this. They will certainly speak of science and power rather than science and power. Nevertheless, this is not something that is generally regarded as correct. It's quite inconceivable for a school teacher in an English school to say to little Johnny, you mustn't say science, you're supposed to smooth it, you must say science. No, never happened. Whereas if little Johnny says hammer, the teacher might well say, you shouldn't say hammer, you must say hammer. All right, so H dropping is something that we all know can't belong in an ideally good pronunciation. But smoothing, no such views. Equally, it's not something that we make efforts to teach foreign learners. It's quite unnecessary for you to do it. It's useful, in my view, for you to know about it so as to recognize it. But it's not necessary to actually produce it. Second example is intrusive R. And I think we can say much the same about that. Real-life speakers use intrusive R's. Virtually everybody who is English uses intrusive R, unless they make some kind of conscious, or perhaps no longer conscious, effort to avoid it. It's part of the ordinary native speech of everybody in England. So when I tell you you should put a comma into something, and I speak without a pause, I'd tell you to put a comma. Now, of course, there are people, speech conscious, who make an effort, and indeed succeed in suppressing those intrusive R's, and can drill themselves to say, put a comma in. But they're not typical. They represent the ideal view. Because there's no letter R in the spelling of comma, therefore people feel there shouldn't be an R in the pronunciation. You may well share that view. But it leads to a direct conflict between the facts of what people actually do and the ideal of what they ought to do. In EFL, again, we don't teach people to use intrusive R, most of us, although, again, I think it's useful for you to know about it so as to avoid being misled when native speakers use it. Third example concerns wh in words spelled with WH, like when, what, where, which. Now, this is by now virtually obsolete in English, except among the speech conscious. It's not something that belongs in the ordinary speech of the English. The Scots have it, the Irish have it, many Americans have it, but not the English. Nevertheless, there is a lingering belief that we ought to do it, we ought to have it. So that when you get people who are speech conscious because they're training to become actors, or because they're newsreaders, or just because they're interested in speech, you often get such people making the effort to say when and where and which, instead of their ordinary when and where and which. As you might expect, this does lead to hypercorrections. And one of our television newsreaders gained notoriety for referring to a warehouse. She's now left newsreading and is a general entertainer. Well, that of course does reveal that for her, as for me, it's not part of your native English to pronounce "quo" in these words. And Daniel Jones really rather far-sightedly decided that that shouldn't be part of the what was taught to EFL students. And this is a point of difference, in fact, between British-oriented EFL and American-oriented EFL, because American-oriented EFL still does on the whole teach "wh," even though perhaps half of the Americans no longer pronounce it. The great thing that Daniel Jones did was to codify EFL, to, among the great mass of variability, to set down what ought to be done and what doesn't need to be done. And that was a very great achievement. Gimson's job and my job is to take this code and to update it as things change. Because RP changes over time. Everything changes over time. No language is static. I've already indicated one or two of the ways in which we've had changes over time. Remember we talked about visibility becoming visibility and so on. What we got in section 2 on the handout, the time dimension, is a summary of some of the current or recent changes during the last 100 years that have applied to received pronunciation. Let's go through these fairly quickly. I apologize that the numbering starts at 6. You can see that that betrays the origins of this handout as part of another one. There we are. I didn't get around to renumbering. Number 6. There's a set of words of which I take cloth as the standard bearer. Words that had historically a short O followed by a voiceless fricative, followed by one of the, so. So words like cough, cloth, cross. About 200 years ago, this vowel lengthened to give or. So we had cough, cloth, and cross. But it wasn't phonetically quite like that, but it would have developed into or by sounding like that if it had developed regularly. And in the first part of this century, received pronunciation on the whole still had cough, cloth, cross, get lost, and so on. Nowadays, these pronunciations sound ludicrous. They are sometimes attributed to this affected aristocratic super URP. I think really they're pretty well obsolete there as well, though they do, it does sometimes persist in the one word off for off. Yeah. What's happened in mainstream RP is that the provincial and old-fashioned cough, cloth, cross that had been hanging around in the background all the time has made a comeback and has returned, so that now, as I'm sure you know, these words are normally pronounced with a short vowel as cough, cloth, cross, get lost, gone, and so on. We can't just say that it's a sound change, because, for example, words like author still have or, in spite of being followed by the. And indeed words like north, where there's an R in the spelling. Point 7 on the handout, related, the distinction that used to exist between a centering diphthong and a long monophthong in the mid-back area has gone. So that 100 years ago people would have distinguished between the floor, on which I stand, and the floor, which is a mistake or some kind of a blemish. Nowadays, no difference for most people. Certainly for me, these are absolutely identical homophones, floor, floor. And for me, therefore, the problem is to remember how to spell which one. Because they sound the same. And this has arisen because all the or words have merged with or. Interesting that Daniel Jones, first decade, second decade of this century, when he was drawing up the classical works on RP, he gave numbers to all the English vowels, didn't he? And this or was number 7, and then or was number 20. And he gives examples of a number of words with or, like door and floor, and the number 4, and so on. And then at the end of his full discussion of or, there's a giveaway footnote that says, oh, by the way, many speakers do not use or, but use number 7 instead. Well, he was quite right, of course, to make this observation, but he nevertheless felt he had to describe the two different possibilities. Gimson, when he produced his introduction, 1962, he was the first British phonetician really to say, no, this is a nonsense, let's just forget entirely about or, and he describes it all in terms of or, and that was a perfectly correct decision. Well, Gimson was one generation older than me, and you can understand therefore why I too believe that there is no point in discussing or in RP at all anymore. So we've lost one sound. Point 8, we're in the process of losing another one, because the diphthong in words like cure, poor, tour, jury, is also on its way out. This is a bit different, because here again, we, on the whole, feel we have a choice. It's like cough or cough. We can either say poor, or we can say poor. And on the whole, we feel these to be two different pronunciations, which we're choosing between. We can say sure, are you sure? Or we can say sure, are you sure? If we say sure, are you sure, it sounds like the shore of the sea, the seashore. Or indeed like the dramatist, George Bernard Shaw. So what is gradually happening is that various lexical items, various words, like sure, certain, are moving from ur to or. If you cast your eyes down to the bottom of the sheet, do you see the figures for poor there? In the opinion poll that I carried out, I found that 57% of my respondents preferred the pronunciation poor, and only 43% of them prefer the pronunciation poor. So I asked people to vote which pronunciation did they prefer for P-R. You can see there, fairly evenly split. I know that I sometimes say sure and sometimes say sure. I know that I sometimes say poor and sometimes say poor. I think I always say tour, but I've heard lots of people say tor, but T-O-U-R. I know I always say jury, and I don't think anybody says jury, but I could be wrong. So it's that the is gradually being removed from one word after another, till ultimately we may be left with no worse than happy. Point 8, we've discussed this several times. This is the tensing of the short I. Finally, happy, becoming happy, or before a vowel, happier, becoming happier. 10, we've discussed as well, the drift from I to before consonants in words like visibility and carelessness. Give another example. My father pronounced this word as private. I pronounce this word as private. And I think we're representative of our respective generations in doing that. Gradual drift from I to her. Though, again, there are millions of people still around who say private, but there are more millions, in my view, who say private, and they seem to be on the increase. Point 11. We discussed this. We changed from O, over the road, at the beginning of this century, to the O, over the road, which we now have. Associated with this is the disappearance of a special weak allophone. The weakening of O used to be O. What happened was you have O and you lose the last part, you're left with a weak O. And this used to come in words like November, phonetics, psychological, and words like that. It's gone. Nobody uses this O anymore. Because we say O, when we weaken that, we're left with O. So now you either say November or you say November. You either say phonetics, if you haven't used the word before, or you say phonetics. So the O that Daniel Jones included in his list, again, can be disregarded. It's gone. I do remember when I was first living in London, I shared a boarding house with a chap who was a television actor who used to do voice-overs, as they were called, for commercials. He couldn't really get very big parts on the television, but he could do these commercials, and he had to do a commercial for a cigarette called Long Gone Olympic. Now he'd been trained as an actor, he wanted to say Olympic, with this O in the first syllable, Olympic. But the producer wouldn't allow that. He said, no, that sounds ridiculously old-fashioned and fuddy-duddy. We want a young, dynamic image for this cigarette. You must say Olympic. And so, of course, the actor did what he was told, but he complained to me at great length afterwards about the degeneration of standards, that people would no longer say Olympic. I wanted Olympic. I had to smile and nod my head, but I thought he was wrong, really, because, of course, I say Olympic too. All right. Along with the loss of one allophone, 11b, there's the rise of another one. This is the O used before dark L. So rather than soul, you'll hear people saying soul. Rather than a whole roll, you get a whole roll. I wouldn't have included this in received pronunciation were it not for the fact that I sent a former public school boy, who was one of our students, to do a project at his old school. And as you know, the so-called public schools, which are actually private boarding schools, tend to set the tone for received pronunciation. And he interviewed a whole number of pupils at his former school and reported the findings back to me, and it was very clear that they had adopted this all very generally. So I think it's come into at least some kinds of received pronunciation. Not necessary for foreign learners to do it though. Point 12. A number of changes of quality. We can look at these quite briefly. Oo used to be backer, shoot, spoon. I still use a fairly back oo. Many people though have a rather central shoot, spoon, goose, which is not as back. The or of thought, force, north is getting closer, so there's an old-fashioned thought, forth, force, north, the Lord calls, and a newer thought, force, north, the Lord calls, and a newer still thought, force, north, the Lord calls, which is incredibly close. But you will hear this, for example, the television reporter Kate Adie is a good example of someone with a very, very close or. Those of you who are into linguistic theory will see that as oo has got central, it's left a space up here, which is why or can move up towards that space. The erstwhile or, of course, has meanwhile also gone central into a diphthong. So those of you who like Martinet's ideas of économie des changements phonétiques and so on can see how we've got a casse-vide up here into which everything can move. Ignore that if you don't understand what it was about. 12c, the a vowel, that bad man has given way to that bad man. Vowel getting opener. When we look at television newsreels from the 1930s, we're struck by the close quality of a. Indeed, as late as the 1940s and 1950s, you can still see this when it was fashionable to say bad and man, with this rather strangulated, rather non-open a. Well, that's now ceased to be fashionable. What's now fashionable is a much opener, bad man, a. And indeed something even opener than that, that bad man you'll sometimes hear, which sounds terribly provincial, but has clearly taken over from a as being fashionable. There are some very interesting advertisements at present on the television for Mercury phones, where a comedian called Harry Enfield is dressed up to look as if he's in the 1940s in a government propaganda film during the war, and he speaks in a caricature of the way people spoke there. And it's very interesting, of course, to see what somebody in the 1990s does to his speech to make it sound like the 1940s. And this a is one of the things, the org is another one, unu, and of course not looking at the camera, bits of scenery falling over, the various things that actors do that they did wrong in the early days of television and filming, all those things are in as well. It's a very clever set of advertisements altogether. Number 12 is another one. Daniel Jones had a rather back quality 12D, loving cup, cut and thrust. Nowadays we have a more central vowel, loving cup, cut and thrust, and there are those who have a rather front one, loving cup, cut and thrust, which is perhaps a little bit Londony. 13, somebody asked me about this epenthesis. Words like fence, where we have N followed by S, and there's a tendency to epenthesize a T between them, saying fence. Instance, there's got two instances of it in the same word. Conscience for conscience. Seems to be on the increase. At least Daniel Jones makes some dismissive remark about it in the foreword of his editions of English Pronouncing Dictionary, saying that it's found but not in the speech of those that I take as a model for this book or something like that. It would be quite wrong to make such a restriction nowadays, because clearly there are plenty of RP speakers who do this. Indeed, when we were making recordings for the spoken version of my Longman Pronunciation Dictionary, which we were doing last month, with actors in a studio saying the words, we had one or two actors with real big problems not doing this. Because we told them, of course, when there are letters written up in the air as optional sounds, not to do them, but italic ones, yes, to do them. So they were supposed not to pronounce a T in fence, not to say fence. But I found that some of the actors really find it very, very difficult to say fence rather than fence. So it clearly wasn't part of their perception of ideal English to avoid these emphases, whereas I think it probably would have been 50 years ago. All right, let's get on. Yod coalescence t and d going to ch and j. Well, of course, this always happened in words like nature, but it's gradually happening in more and more environments. Jones's perpetual has become present-day perpetual. Jones's graduate has become graduate, very commonly. Jones's actual has certainly become actual. Nevertheless, in stressed syllables, this is still regarded as not pucker, not real RP. So, although lots of people say tune and reduce, RP has to have tune and reduce. People are sort of sensitive to that distinction. 15, T-glottling, we've talked about this in the context of Cockney, but it's not just Cockney. Before strong consonants, obstruents and nasals and things, it seems perfectly okay for word final T, so quite can be pronounced quite in phrases like quite good, quite nice, quite wrong, although it's perhaps not quite RP, or not only for the youngest RP speakers in phrases like quite easy, becoming quite easy, or get it out, becoming get it out. No, that's not possible, that's just Cockney. Perhaps get it out, though, is beginning to be on the margins of RP, where we have American voice T, glottal stop, and regular T in those three respective positions. Get it out. And use it. Vivica, who's doing research into allophones of T, you can do some working out as to why you get those three different things in three different places. 16 on the handout, L vocalization. Again, we had this in the context of Cockney, but as Gimson points out 30 years ago, this is heard in casual RP in the adjacent positions to the labials. Now, shelf has got a labial there, an F. And that explains why you can get shelf. Shelf. Even within RP, it's not noticed. Tables. Tables. And middle, even. We have one member of staff, academic staff in this department, who uses no dark L's at all, but vocalizes them. I'm not saying who it is, and it's not someone who's teaching you, but it tells us the way things are going, because her speech doesn't sound odd or unusual. It's only the fact that we're phoneticians that enables us to note this fact. Once it's submerged into everything else that's quite normal and ordinary for educated English people, it passes unremarked. Well, those are a whole lot of sound changes, which are gradual things in many cases. If you ask people about pronunciation, or if they raise the topic, they're often concerned not so much with these fairly technical subtleties of articulation. They are typically concerned with much cruder questions like, for this given word X, is it right to say A or B? And that's the things we've got at the bottom of the handout, where it's particular words in the vocabulary, and there are two or more rival pronunciations in use, and some people say one, some people say the other. Sometimes we can associate this with a change over time if we find that there's a tendency for older people to use one pronunciation and younger people to use the other. Now, in connection with the Longer Pronunciation Dictionary, I did carry out this opinion poll where I had 275 people who answered a long questionnaire, nearly 100 words in it, asking them which pronunciation they preferred. And they did also tell me their age, or age group, so that I was able to compare different age groups. And what we have here, which you don't find in the dictionary, is the actual figures for different age groups. So, first of all, the word that's either nephew or nephew. Well, which is the older pronunciation? We know that nephew must be the older one because this word came into English from French, and in French it's pronounced neveu. So it must have come in as some form of neveu or something, and when we anglicize it as nephew. But it's spelt with PH, partly because of, we know the Latin origin of this, in nepos, spelt with a P. And in due course, the PH spelling has given rise to a spelling pronunciation with nephew. Well, in fact, 4/5, 79% of my respondents prefer nephew. But what is interesting is if you compare the people by year of birth, those born before 1922, up to and including 1922, a full half of them preferred nephew. 49% preferred nephew, 51% preferred nephew, the newer pronunciation. But by the time we get to those born in or after 1963, you can see that it's 92% for the new pronunciation, and therefore only 8% the old one. So there's a big change over time there. Now, I've also got this in a graph, which perhaps makes it easier to see what I mean. I hope that's big enough for you to be able to follow it. The line for nephew is the top line here. Here we've got percentage scales, the proportion of people in the opinion poll preferring the pronunciation of nephew with an F. And you can see for the oldest age group, it was just about half. For those born between 1923 and 1947, it was nearly 3/4. For those born between 1947 and 1962, it was very nearly everybody, as it is for those born since 1962. So, clear age grading, as we call it, statistically here. A link between a person's age and the pronunciation they prefer. On this graph, we've also got, secondly, the line for suit taking over from suit. Do you prefer suit or suit, they were asked. And again, for those born up to 1923, it was about equal for suit or suit, but then a steady increase in preference for suit, till with the youngest people, overwhelmingly, suit is preferred over suit. So we see the pronunciation suit gradually disappearing. And the last one on this handout, which isn't on the board, which isn't on the handout, is the word issue or issue. This is the number of people who prefer either issue or issue, that's with a sh in it, as against the older pronunciation issue. And you can see again a steady increase as we go from the older to the younger people. The actor Sir Michael Hordern, some of you may have seen him in films and plays, went on record as saying, "The pronunciation issue makes me feel physically ill." Well, of course, he is among the oldest group, but he's going to feel terribly ill if he listens to young people. Here's a similar graph, or graph, for the words deity taking over from deity, ate as the past tense of eat taking over from et, and patriotic taking over from patriotic. Now, you can see first of all with deity, deity, that for the oldest age group, the majority preferred deity, deity was a minority pronunciation. But by the time we get to the youngest age group, deity is in fact almost universal. I was aware of this one because I know I say deity, and I found Daniel Jones didn't even record the possibility of deity, but only deity. Gibson quite rightly recorded it as a possibility, but it was left to me to demonstrate that 80% of people now prefer deity, so clearly we have to give it first choice. This is an interesting one, the past tense of eat. We used to think of this as an American-British difference, that Americans say ate and we say et. I ate my dinner, but you can see that the younger you are, if you're English, these are English respondents, the younger you are, the more likely you are to have ate, and for the youngest age group, more than half of the people now prefer ate over et. The last one is interesting because it's what is still a minority pronunciation, patriotic, thought of as American again, as against the traditional British patriotic. Nah. But although it's still a minority form, it is becoming more and more usual. Here we've got zebra taking over from zebra, poor taking over from poor, and salt taking over from salt. Zebra is interesting because the Americans all say zebra. Zebra is only a British form, and because of some of the other ones and general considerations, you might think that British English is becoming increasingly Americanized. Well, this is a good example of a case where we're moving away from American English. Americans say zebra, but we are going more and more in favour of zebra. And for the youngest age groups, in fact, I think it's 98% in favour of zebra rather than zebra. Poor, we've talked about. Salt, becoming salt. This, again, stands for a number of words, including also words like false, where false is another possibility. These figures, in fact, came as a surprise to me. I didn't do this survey till right at the end of the compilation process of the dictionary, so the figures had to be written in at a very late stage in the proof. It was too late by then to change the order that I gave and the recommendations that I gave, except in one or two cases where I made a great effort to do so, like in demonstrable rather than the demonstrable that I've given. But in fact, the figures were slightly more favouring salt than salt, and maybe that means in a future edition one ought to give that pronunciation preference. Here are some stress changes. Stress moving from the first syllable to the second syllable. So that applicable becomes applicable, that's the top line. Controversy becomes controversy, that's the second line. And formidable becomes formidable, that's the third line. And you can see that the younger you are, the more likely you are to have stress on the second syllable in those words. More stress things here. Same thing. Older people with initial stress, younger people with stress on the second syllable, so that kilometre gives way to kilometre, primarily gives way to primarily, and harass gives way to harass. In each case, I've done statistical tests on these, and there is a very high significance to the correlation observed between age and pronunciation preference. Well, looking back on the handout, the last example there is the word that I call often. I included this because people often ask me about it. And as you can see, I prefer a pronunciation with no T sound, although 1/3 of my respondents prefer it often with a T, so you can do what you like. Notice also that 1% preferred a pronunciation with or, often. What I don't tell you there is that that 1%, which was either 2 or 3 respondents, I've forgotten which, were all aged more than 65. They were all in the oldest age group, which is exactly what you think. Okay, that's the end really of the lecture, but just 3 little points. First of all, questionnaires. I handed out evaluation questionnaires yesterday. I hope you all received one. You didn't, well, if not, ask for one. And you can fill it in, please, and return it to the secretary, or to me. That's very valuable. Each year I ask people to do these, and your response is very important for us. If you have good handouts this year, that's because previous years complained about bad handouts. All right, so we do try and fit in with your wishes. Second point, next year's dates. If you have enjoyed the course or found it valuable, I hope you will, well, come again if you wish, but in particular tell your friends, tell your colleagues, and encourage them to come. The last thing is the farewell party at 1 o'clock will be in the upper refectory, and I hope to see you all there then. Thank you.